Greetings. We are continuing our study on Wednesday nights. We've been looking on Wednesday nights at ways that the New Testament uses the Old Testament, particularly the Gospel writers, and the way that the Old Testament shapes their telling of the story of Jesus. We've looked at John, particularly his use of Jewish feast days. We've looked at Matthew and Luke a little bit. Matthew kind of mirrors the story of Moses with the story of Jesus, and Luke very clearly mirrors the story of Elijah with the story of Jesus. But in both instances, you come to find out that Jesus is greater than Moses and is greater than Elijah. Even though there are parallels between their stories and points of interaction, there are also ways where Jesus' story takes off and in unexpected and in really impressive ways that exceed and excel past what Moses and Elijah did. Last week we looked at Matthew. And we looked particularly at Matthew's use of the phrase to fulfill. This happened to fulfill this. And then he'll quote something from the Old Testament. He does that repeatedly in the story of Jesus, mostly in the first couple of chapters, although a couple times throughout. But he's very explicit with the way that he uses the Old Testament. Matthew doesn't want to leave things ambiguous. We started off last week by looking at a difference between the way Matthew tells the story and uses the Old Testament and the way Mark uses the Old Testament. And we looked at one of the accounts that appears in both Matthew and Mark. And it's worded almost the exact same way in both accounts. In Mark, it is Mark chapter 11, and it's the triumphal entry. And Jesus sends his disciples ahead of him to go untie an animal for him to ride in, a colt, and some people are going to ask them, what are you doing untying this colt? And they're supposed to say, well, the Lord has need of it. And so if you look at Mark 11:3, if anyone says to you, why are you doing this? You say, the Lord has need of it. And immediately he will send it back here. Then they went away and they found the colt tied to a door outside in the street, and they untied it. And some of the bystanders were saying to them, what are you doing untying the colt? They spoke in just as Jesus told them to, and then they gave them permission. Then they go and they bring it back to Jesus, and Jesus rides into Jerusalem on it. All right, that's the way Mark tells the story. In Matthew chapter 21, it's told almost the same way, but notice Jesus is saying, he's telling them what to do. In verse 3, he again says, if anyone says anything to you, you shall say, the Lord has need of them, and immediately he will send them. And this took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, gentle and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, a foal of the beast of burden. And the disciples went and did just as Jesus had instructed them, and brought the donkey and the colt. Anyway, so you read the stories, and Jesus says almost the exact same thing in both of them. But Matthew has this little insertion that says, this took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. And then he quotes Zechariah 9:9. In Mark, the same thing happens. That means the same passage would have been fulfilled, but Mark just doesn't tell the reader that. Matthew makes sure you don't want to miss it. So Mark, if you're trying to figure out how Mark is fulfilling the Old Testament, you don't look for a citation that says, this happened to fulfill this. You look at the words that he uses. Someone like a king who's riding into town on a donkey. That should put in your mind, if you're familiar with the book of Zechariah, an image from Zechariah. And you go back and you read the Zechariah passage and you think, that seems to be echoing pretty strongly. That seems to be reverberating throughout the text. What Jesus is doing here as he enters Jerusalem is what that king who brings peace is doing in Zechariah 9:9. I wonder if there's a connection between the two. Matthew, make sure you don't wonder. Matthew says, this has happened to fulfill this. But Mark is the king of ambiguity. Mark leads the reader in a certain direction. He leaves clues in the text. He does things subtly, and you're left wondering and thinking and perhaps digging and trying to figure out. I think that's intentional. I think Mark wants you to dig deeper and to think and to meditate and to see what you can figure out. I'm going to give you one more example of a similar type of thing, and then we're going to focus more deeply on the Gospel of Mark itself and how perhaps the way Mark uses the Old Testament is very subtle, but can teach you some really, really important things. The other passage I wanted to look at is in Mark chapter 13. Mark chapter 13 in verse 14. All right, so Mark chapter 13 and verse 14. Jesus is here discussing the destruction of Jerusalem that's going to take place. He's discussing when Rome is going to come in and destroy the temple, destroy the city of Jerusalem. This takes place in AD 70, and Jesus is talking about that cataclysmic event. In chapter 13 and verse 14, he says, "But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains." What he's saying is basically when they start getting close to the temple and you see that they are about to bring abomination of desolation there at the temple, then flee. Get out of there. Go to the mountains. The one who is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak, and woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies, because it's hard to run when you're holding the baby, or it's hard to run when you're pregnant. He's saying literally when you see them coming, get out of town right then. Don't go back for your coat. Just leave, because destruction is going to follow. But notice verse 14. When you see the abomination of desolation, notice that phrase, and then he says, standing where it should not be. The abomination of desolation standing where it should not be. And then he doesn't tell you. He doesn't tell you where it should not be. He doesn't fill that in for you. And he also doesn't tell you that the phrase abomination of desolation comes from an earlier passage. It comes from something that the reader who is paying attention should be aware of. Rather than telling you what passage he's talking about, and rather than telling you where the should not be place is, he instead gives a little note to the reader right there in the middle of the verse. Let the reader understand. It's Jesus didn't say let the reader understand, because Jesus isn't speaking to readers, he's speaking to listeners. Mark, however, while writing the words of Jesus, does this little parenthetical statement, hey reader, listen carefully. The phrase abomination of desolation, that should ring a few bells in your head. Pay careful attention when he says standing where it ought not be. Where is that? Let the reader understand. And then he keeps going with it. Okay, that's the way Mark tells the story. Notice the ambiguity. Notice he doesn't come out and directly say, this is the passage I'm talking about, and this is where the abomination of desolation is going to happen. He leaves it up to the reader to understand it on their own. Matthew's not quite like that. Matthew does still use that phrase, let the reader understand. But notice Matthew chapter 24. This is where Matthew is telling the story. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, and then Matthew adds, which was spoken through Daniel the prophet. And so it's giving the same sentence, but Matthew is making sure you don't miss where it's from. It's spoken through Daniel the prophet, standing, notice Mark said where it ought not be. Matthew says, standing in the holy place. Then let the reader understand. So Matthew doesn't leave things nearly as subtle as Mark does. He doesn't leave things nearly as ambiguous. He fills the reader in so that the reader knows, okay, I should read Daniel right now. And so that the reader knows, oh, he's talking about the temple. Matthew is always just about clarifying and making more explicit things that Mark leaves ambiguous. It's not just here. This happens over and over and over again throughout the gospel, where if you, most of what you read in Mark is told in Matthew. Even a lot of them use the exact same words. And so Matthew ultimately in church history became a much more popular gospel because you get a lot more out of Matthew. You have almost everything that's in Mark, plus you have all of Matthew's material that is unique to Matthew, plus you have things in Mark are clarified in Matthew. And so there's a lot more explicit instruction in Matthew. But I love the Gospel of Mark. Mark is shorter, it's very fast-paced, and Mark leaves things to the reader to really chew on and to meditate on and to think about. I don't think that Mark cares less about the Old Testament than Matthew does. Matthew uses the Old Testament a lot more explicitly. And Matthew will say things like, this happened to fulfill this, or this is what was spoken by Daniel, or he quotes the Old Testament more, but I don't think that means he uses it more. I think they just use the Old Testament in different ways. Mark uses the Old Testament in a very subtle and somewhat ambiguous way for the reader to really try to dig into and digest and think about and meditate on. Matthew clears everything up for the reader and just boldly states stuff pretty clearly. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the ways that I think Mark uses the Old Testament and does so in a way that calls us as the reader to think and to dig deeper and to really meditate on what's being said. So to begin with Mark, he actually starts off his whole gospel with a quotation from the Old Testament. He doesn't. He does start off by saying, "All right, this happened," and he quotes the Old Testament all the way in the first 2 verses. So if you look at Mark chapter 1 and verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. And then he gives this quotation: "Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, make ready the paths of the Lord," or the ways of the Lord, make his paths straight. That quotation's an interesting one. It sometimes is called a conflated quote. Basically, he says it's written in Isaiah the prophet. But if you read that quotation doesn't, the whole quotation doesn't directly come from Isaiah. Part of the quotation comes from Isaiah. But another part of the quotation comes from Malachi chapter 3, and another part of it comes from Exodus chapter 23. It's a conflation of several Old Testament passages pressed together. So you're getting Isaiah, Malachi, and Exodus. And what's fascinating about it is the Exodus quotation and the Isaiah quotation are both very clearly about the Exodus out of Egypt, like leaving Egypt. In the book of Exodus, it's about leaving Egypt itself. In the book of Isaiah, there's all kinds of Exodus imagery, particularly in chapters like 40 through 55, where they Isaiah seems to be picturing a time of Babylonian captivity, and that isn't going to last forever, and they're going to be able to return back home from captivity in Babylon, which is a lot like returning home from captivity in Egypt. And so he uses language all the way through it that's a lot like that Egypt stuff, leaving Egypt and going back home. And so if you read this passage, you just think about some of the words that are used. A voice of one crying in the wilderness. Well, where were the children of Israel for 40 years in the Exodus, in the book of Numbers, as they were leaving Egypt? 40 years wandering in the wilderness. But this says, make ready the way of the Lord and make his paths straight. The picture in Isaiah is of a highway going through the wilderness back home. The idea is that it's not just like an Exodus where you end up in the wilderness for 40 years. There's a highway leading you home. It's a better Exodus. It's a more clear Exodus. It's a more righteous Exodus that's leading you back to the promised land, leading you back home. And I think Mark is starting off his gospel by saying that that's happening. We're heading back home, and someone is coming to bring us back home. The Lord is coming. And someone needs to prepare his way to bring us back. Someone's got to prepare the highway for the Lord. And so the person we're introduced to out in the wilderness preparing the highway for the Lord is John the Baptist. So look at chapter 1 and verse 4. John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness. Well, that's a good place for him to be, right? Because that's where the setting is taking place. He's in the wilderness preparing the way for the Lord. John the Baptist is in the wilderness. And then notice verse 12. After he baptizes Jesus, immediately the Spirit impelled him, or Jesus, cast Jesus, literally, the word is ekbalo, it literally cast Jesus out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days being tempted by Satan. So John the Baptist goes to the wilderness. He's preaching, he's teaching, people are going out there and repenting. Then Jesus goes and is baptized. Then Jesus goes to the wilderness and experiences 40 days of temptation without giving in to sin. And so you have Jesus kind of following the Exodus story, only being successful in it. He goes to the wilderness also. But all of that wilderness stuff, you're seeing the word wilderness, like the whole setting of the first half of the first chapter of Mark is the wilderness. And where does that setting come from? Well, it comes from the Old Testament, someone preparing a way in the wilderness. But notice something else. Who is John preparing the way for? If you read the passage in verse 3, it says, make ready the way of the Lord. And if you're reading Isaiah 40 in verse 3, that's where that's coming from. The word Lord there is actually the word Yahweh. Like, it's the word for the covenant name of the God of Israel, right? He's coming again to be with his people. I think you're getting something really powerful to start off the Gospel of Mark. You're getting a brand new exodus out of slavery. Someone's leading us through the wilderness into the promised land. And who is it? It's Yahweh coming to be among his people. It is the Lord who is coming to be with us. And so if you're reading this and John the Baptist is preparing the way for the Lord, who is taking the place of the Lord? Jesus is. And so you start off with this Old Testament image of Jesus filling the role of the Lord. And I think that's supposed to be in your mind as you read the rest of the Gospel of Mark. Because what we'll see over and over again, Mark won't always say, and this happened to fulfill this passage. But if you read the story of Jesus, with Jesus filling in the role of the Lord in the story, then a bunch of passages about God from the Old Testament start to come to light. I'll give just a couple of examples as we make our way through. Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2, Jesus in the first chapter, his ministry's going really, really well. And like crowds upon crowds upon crowds are gathering to follow him. And everything he's doing is going great. And people are amazed and astonished. And it's like the kingdom's coming and it's going to come with ease. But then you get to chapter 2 and it's just a bunch of conflicts. Conflict after conflict after conflict. Leading up to chapter 3 and verse 6, where after the fifth conflict, they decide they're going to kill him. So they want to destroy him because he's not easy to control or to contain. Each of these conflicts has an interesting question that is asked. So like in chapter 2 in verse 16, this is the second conflict. The question is, why is he eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners? Verse 18, the third conflict. Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? The fourth conflict is in chapter 2 and verse 24. The Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing, your disciples, doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? And then the final conflict, the people are silent, but Jesus turns and asks them the question. In chapter 3 in verse 4, Jesus said to them, is it lawful to do good or to harm on the Sabbath? To save life or to kill? That should be a really easy question, by the way. But they don't answer it. Jesus gets angry. He heals a man on the Sabbath, and they decide they want to kill him. All right, so those are conflict 2 through 5, and it ends with them wanting to kill Jesus. And it also ends with him flipping the questions around and asking them. But notice what I did is I skipped the first one, because that's the one we're going to focus on right now. The first one is Jesus is in a house, possibly his house. Someone opens up the roof and lowers down a paralyzed guy. Remember the crowds are getting so big in chapter 1? Well, they can't even get the paralyzed guy through the crowds to Jesus. So they go up over the crowd, onto the roof, down through the roof. They bring the guy in. Jesus sees this and he's kind of astonished at, that they would do this. But it's also amazing the level of faith that they had, that they were so zealous to get to Jesus that they would actually cut a hole in the roof to lower the guy down. And so they do it. Jesus sees it, and instead of healing the man, says, son, your sins are forgiven. It's because of their faith the man's sins are forgiven. Now that is a problem. Imagine you came to my house and you were needing me to do something for you, and I put my hand on you and I said, I forgive you of all of your sins. What would that mean to you? Maybe not a lot, because I can't really do that. No matter how much I want a person to be forgiven of their sins, I can't do that. I can forgive them like from my own personal, attitude or my own personal feelings. I could say I forgive you, but my forgiveness doesn't do much in the grand scheme of eternity for another person. Like, I can't actually wipe away the sins of another person. Jesus looks at the guy and says, your sins are forgiven. Well, the Pharisees noticed that really quickly. Verse 6 and 7, some of the scribes sitting there were reasoning in their hearts, why does this man speak this way? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? They hear Jesus do this and they think, wait a minute, you can't do that. You can't forgive. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Now, in this passage, Mark doesn't quote the Old Testament at all. But why are they thinking no one can forgive sins but God alone? It's because they've read their Old Testaments. That's not necessary. I don't know that he has a particular passage in mind as much as a bunch of passages that appear all the way through the Old Testament that tell us who forgives sins. Like Exodus 34, 6 and 7, that God is the one who forgives sin, iniquity, and transgression. That is what God does. God is the one who is who you go to for forgiveness. God is the only one who has that role. And so in this passage, when they're thinking, wait a minute, why is this man That's blasphemy, isn't it? To say that you're forgiving sins? Like when they hear Jesus do that, they immediately, because of their knowledge of the Old Testament, think he's putting himself in the place of God. That's blasphemy. But remember how the Gospel of Mark starts out, preparing a way for the Lord. Jesus will repeatedly put himself in the place of God and say and do things that only God can say and do. And that understanding of Jesus is deeply rooted in various Old Testament passages, like right here. They're relying on Old Testament teaching about who forgives sins, and they're judging Jesus because of it. Jesus goes on to prove that he can do this as the Son of Man because he has the authority to forgive sins on earth, and he proves it by then healing the man. So he gives the guy spiritual healing and physical healing, heals him from the inside out, and we see all that again. That's the type of thing that only God can do. Look now at our next example, Mark chapter 4. Jesus begins speaking in parables. Not a lot of people get the parables. His disciples are supposed to get the parables, but even they don't seem to get the parables, so he has to try to explain things to them in private. But what you'll see throughout Mark, if you read it, is the disciples are kind of slow to get a lot of things that Jesus says and does. Well, after speaking in parables quite a bit, verse 35, the chapter ends with Jesus doing something really, really remarkable. It says, "On that day, when evening came, he said to them, 'Let us go over to the other side.' And leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat, just as he was, and the other boats were with him. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up. Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him, and they said to him, 'Teacher, teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Hush, be still.' And the wind died down, and the sea became perfectly calm." Now that's an interesting thing to do, because I have rebuked people before. I've rebuked my sons before. I've never rebuked the wind, and I've never said to the sea, "Hush, be still." And in fear and in reverence, they obeyed me. What's going on here? How is it that Jesus, as a man, can rebuke wind and tell the sea to hush and be still? That's something that I can't do. I would look crazy if I tried to do it. Who do you know who can do that? Nobody can. In fact, when the disciples see it, that's what they start thinking. Who can do this? I don't know anyone who can do this. Verse 40. "And Jesus said to them, 'Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?' And they became very much afraid and said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" Remember, Mark leaves things ambiguous a lot. That question is the end of the story. Like, it doesn't move on from there. In Matthew, it has them falling down and worshiping him at the end of the story. But in Mark, he leaves it with a question that we're, I think, supposed to answer. A question that we're supposed to chew on and meditate. Okay, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey? Who is it that the wind must answer to, that the wind can be rebuked by, and that the sea must obey? Well, if you start reading your Old Testament, you'll see an answer will appear. It appears quite a few times, actually, in the Psalms, like Psalm 65:5, Psalm 89 in verse 9. The passage we're going to look at is in Psalm 107, because I think that's probably the most clear, where you see the same type of thing. Remember the words of Jesus, "Hush, be still." All right. Psalm 107 describes what sailors have learned about God out on the sea. Start in verse 23. "Those who go down to the sea in ships, and who do business on great waters, they have seen the works of the Lord, and his wonders in the deep. And he spoke and raised up a stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They rose up to the heavens, they went down to the depths, and their souls melted away in their misery." So they're saying God sends storms, and the seas rise, and the seas fall, and the hearts of the sailors are in misery. Verse 27, "The sailors reeled like a drunken and staggered like a drunken man. They were at their wits' end. And then they cried to the Lord in their trouble." Remember, Jesus is asleep. And the disciples run up to him crying out, saying, "Lord, Jesus, teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?" It's like they're at their wits' end and they cry out to the Lord for help. "And he brought them out of their distress." Kind of like what Jesus did. Notice especially verse 29. He caused the storm to be still, and the waves in the sea were hushed. Hush, be still. Verse 29. He caused the storm to be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. He uses the same words there that Jesus uses to calm the sea in Mark 4. That's a strong echo of what's taking place back here in Psalm 107. So like Psalm 107, you have people out on the sea, a storm arises, they're terrified, they don't know what to do, they cry out to the Lord for help, and the Lord hushes and stills the sea. In the story in Mark chapter 4, the disciples are out on a boat, a storm arises, they're terrified, they're scared, they don't know what to do, they cry out to the Lord, and he hushes and stills the sea. Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? In this passage, it is clearly God in Psalm 107. The God of Israel is the one who has that power. So as you begin thinking about that answer, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? What the answer to that question is, I believe, without saying it directly, Mark is leading you to ponder. Perhaps this person that we found is no mere person at all. Perhaps he is something dangerously more than that. And they respond with fear to it. Okay, look now at Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6 will be the next example we look at. This is the feeding of the 5,000. One of the things you'll notice if you read Mark is pretty much everything takes place going to and from the water. Like it's either on a boat or going across to this side or going across to the other side. Like a lot of the stories start that way. In verse 33 says, the people saw them going, and many recognized them and ran there together afoot in the cities and got there ahead of them. And when Jesus went ashore, so Jesus is on a boat, the people run around to the other side to meet him when he arrives, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. That's an important phrase right there. It introduces the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 in Mark chapter 6. That Jesus sees them and they are like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus is likened to a sheep, or to a shepherd, and the people like a sheep in numerous other passages. Matthew does it, John chapter 10 very clearly. But Mark chapter 6 is the only one where the story of the feeding the 5,000 is introduced with Jesus calling himself a shepherd and saying that these people are sheep in need of a shepherd. And so he begins to teach them many things. And when it's already quite late, verse 35, his disciples came and said to him, this place is desolate and it is quite late. Send them away so that we may go to the surrounding countryside and the villages and buy them something to eat. Jesus said, you give them something to eat. And they said, shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give them something to eat? And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go look. And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. All right, so here's what's going down. Jesus is beside the seashore. There's crowds of sheep. He is the shepherd. He's teaching them, and now he recognizes that the sheep on the seashore are hungry. And he says, go get them something to eat. The disciples say, we don't have the money to do that. And Jesus, I think, was hoping they would give a better answer than that, but they don't. And so Jesus says, okay, I'll show you what you do. Verse 39, he commanded them all to sit down by groups on the green grass. And he set them in groups of hundreds and of fifties. Isn't that an interesting phrase? He had them sit down on green grass. What an interesting detail to add, that the grass was green. Here's what I think might be happening right here. When you think of Old Testament passages about sheep and shepherds, there's quite a few that come to mind. Exodus 34 is a really important one. But think about probably the most famous of them all, Psalm 23. You have a shepherd with sheep beside the seashore who makes them sit down or lie down on green grass or green pastures. Jesus is very much fulfilling the role of a shepherd here. In Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down on green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. The shepherd is the one who feeds the sheep. The shepherd is the one who leads the sheep beside the waters, which is where they are, where the setting of this whole story is. He's the one who makes them lie down on green pastures. Plus, Jesus has just said he sees them as sheep in need of a shepherd. I think that Mark doesn't say, and this happened to fulfill Psalm 23, but I think those clues are supposed to be bringing the reader to some conclusions about Jesus. Let the reader understand, is the way Mark says it a little later. I think you're supposed to be seeing Jesus as fulfilling the role of the shepherd. Remember, he's coming to prepare the way of the Lord. The Lord is coming to be with his people. Jesus is going to start doing things that only the Lord can do. What man can feed 5,000 people with bread the way Jesus does? I tell you, the good shepherd of Israel can, though. The one who can make the people lie down on the green grass beside the still waters. And I think that as this story continues, that identification of Jesus as the God of Israel becomes even more clear with the next thing that takes place. So verse 45, we're going to read a little bit further. Jesus feeds the 5,000. They pick up all the I think 12 baskets full of broken pieces afterwards. Verse 45. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat, and they go ahead of him to the other side of Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the crowd away. So again, going across the lake again, just like all the stories we've seen so far. But Jesus sends them out, and he stays with the crowds for a little while. He sends the crowds away. Verse 46, after bidding them farewell, he left to a mountain to pray. And then verse 47, when it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, it was about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and he intended to pass by them. Notice those two phrases. Jesus came walking on the sea, and he intended to pass by them. The first of those is pretty clear what it means. He was walking on the sea. The second of those is kind of interesting. Why is he intending to pass by them? But they see him, and they actually don't understand who it is when they see him. They see him, and he's beyond their recognition. So verse 49, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost, and they cried out. But he saw them, and they were terrified. And immediately he spoke with them and said to them, take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. Okay, I think there's a couple of things going on here. On the one hand, it is often in the Old Testament God, the one who says, do not be afraid. You know, I am with you. Do not be afraid. What can man do to you? Like that's often the role that God has, the one who is taking a terrified people and trying to calm them. But then also notice when he says, it is I in verse 50, that is not literally, it is I in Greek. That is the phrase ego eimi. That is I am. That is the exact same phrase that you would find in, for example, Exodus chapter 3, when the I am is revealing himself to Moses. And Moses says, who is it that I'm saying is sending me? He says, I am is sending you. I think you're having a lot of allusions to God being the one who says, do not be afraid. You certainly have an allusion, I believe, to Exodus chapter 3 when Jesus says the I am. But then think about the whole story itself. Who walks on the water? If you're looking for who calms the water, there's quite a few passages that mention that God is the one who stills the storms and calms the water in the Old Testament. We've read Psalm 107. There's other ones like it. You actually don't have very much in the Old Testament about God being the one who walks on the water. You have God being the one who splits the sea in the Exodus so that people can walk on dry land. But where do you have God walking on the water? I reading a book this last week called Reading Backwards Figural Christology and the Fourfold Gospel Witness by Richard Hayes. He has a really interesting take on this, and I think he might be onto something. Look with me at the book of Job, chapter 9. Job, chapter 9. In verse 8. This is a description of God in all his greatness, and the God who creates. And it says in verse 8, who alone, talking about God, he alone stretches out the heavens. And then notice the phrase, and tramples down the waves of the sea. How do you trample down something? Well, you could do it by like stepping on it, like, you stomp on it. And so trampling down the waves of the sea, that kind of has the image a little bit of God walking on water, God stomping on the water. But you might think that's a bit of a reach, and maybe it is. Except for the fact that that's the way the Hebrew text words it. In the Old Testament, there is something called the Septuagint. Just like we read the Bible in English, Greek-speaking first-century Christians often read the Bible in Greek. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament is called the Septuagint. So most of the time, when Mark does quote the Old Testament, He's quoting it from the Septuagint. If you're wanting to find verbal echoes, like back and forth between the Old Testament and the New Testament, what you need to do is get yourself a copy of the Septuagint. It will help you more than anything else in this type of study. And you know what it says in this passage in the Septuagint? In the Greek, which is what Mark is reading and referencing, it does not say he tramples down the waves of the sea. It says he walks on the sea as on dry ground. That's amazing. In Mark, Jesus is the one who walks on the sea. And in Job chapter 9, God is the one who walks on the sea as on dry ground. That should probably, he doesn't say this happened to fulfill Mark chapter 9, but I think that echo should think, wow, who's the one who can walk on the sea? The only one in the Old Testament who I know who does it is the God of Israel himself in the Septuagint. He walks on the sea as on dry ground. But then remember that odd little phrase we mentioned that said he intended to pass by them? You know, in Job chapter 9, that exact expression is used again. If you look at verse 11, it says, were he to pass by me, I would not see him. Were he to move past me, I would not perceive him. It's talking about God being so grand that people can't even recognize him. He could pass right by me and I wouldn't even see him. In the Septuagint, the word that Mark uses for he intended to pass by is the exact same word that's right here. And where Jesus walks on the seas on dry ground, that's what he does right here. Like, you're starting to see a couple of echoes between and connections between these two passages right here. Notice also in Mark where it says they intended to pass by and they saw him. Did they recognize him? No, they didn't recognize him. They thought he was a ghost and they get terrified. Like, the Lord is passing right by them and they don't recognize him. They think it's a ghost. And how does Jesus clue them in that it's not a ghost? It's him. He says, I am. Do not be afraid. All of this, I think if you read it and couple it with him just having fed the people as the good shepherd of the people who made them lie down on the green grass beside the still waters, all of this is very strongly hinting at the identity of Jesus as being the shepherd of Israel, being the great I am, being the one who walks on the water, being the one who forgives sins, being the one who can calm and still the seas, being the one who is the Lord who is coming again to be with his people. That's how Mark begins. The Lord is coming, make his path straight, and all of a sudden we start seeing Jesus do all the things that the God of Israel, the Lord, does. All right, I want to end by looking at one final passage in Mark chapter 14. We'll see a lot of these things converge in Mark chapter 14. Jesus is on trial here. Jesus is about to be crucified, and he's being questioned. And he's finally, the high priest, verse 60, Mark chapter 14. The high priest stood and came forward and questioned him. Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying about you? But Jesus kept silent and did not answer. So in that, he's kind of maybe reminding you of Isaiah 53, the sheep before her shearers who does not open his mouth. But verse 61 continues. Again, the high priest was questioning him and saying, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? All right, this is as straightforward as you're going to get. Jesus has not been this straightforward at any point in the Gospel of Mark so far. He's about to clearly say some things about himself. And Mark is usually pretty ambiguous. Well, right here, Jesus is about to give some answers. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Beloved? Verse 62, Jesus said, I am. Guess what? That's the same phrase. That's the same phrase from walking on the water when he says, I am, do not be afraid. It's the same phrase from Exodus chapter 3 at the burning bush. It is ego eimi. It is a phrase that has very strong divine overtones. Jesus answers and says, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. All right, a couple of things are happening right here. The idea of Jesus sitting at the right hand. If you read Psalm 110, that's the psalm that begins, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. One of the things that's really odd is if you read much about God in the Old Testament, it becomes pretty clear that he doesn't like to share his title of God with others. He's a jealous God. He doesn't like you to worship other gods. He doesn't share his godness with other beings or with lesser divine beings. But yet here he's sharing the throne room with another person who is seated right at his right hand. That's an honorific place to be. The I am is sitting at the right hand of the I am. And he says, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. That's a reference to Daniel chapter 7, where the I am comes and he rides the clouds up to the one who sits on the throne, and he receives a kingdom and power and glory and honor and worship forever and ever. Like, you read that Daniel chapter 7, and you're seeing that God is sharing his throne room with another and giving a kingdom to another who will be worshipped as he is worshipped by every tribe and tongue and nation of mankind. And Jesus calls upon those passages, Exodus 3, Psalm 110, Daniel chapter 7, and combines them all in his answer. He is the one who shares the throne with God. He is the one who is the I am. He is the one who comes riding on the clouds of heaven, who receives a kingdom and power and glory and worship and honor forever and ever. He is the one who is unlike any man. He is the one who is God come to be with us. It's a fascinating study to look at the way that Mark uses the Old Testament. But notice right here, in Mark 62, he directly cites and combines the phrases from several verses, but he does not say, and this was to fulfill Exodus chapter 3, or Psalm 110, or Daniel chapter 7. But he uses the language of each of those passages to give you a fuller understanding of who Jesus is. I love the Gospel of Mark. I think it's fun. I think it challenges us to dig deeper into the text. And next week, we will continue looking at some ways that the Gospels will teach about Jesus using references, allusions to, or direct citations from the Old Testament. But hopefully, we're kind of starting to see that they all have their own style in the way that they do this. And to me, Mark's style is one of the most fun to read. Anyway, God bless. I love you all. I hope you enjoyed the study. May the love of God be with you.